Most gardeners looking at a tomato plant loaded with thick, dark green leaves assume they are doing something right. The leaves look healthy. The plant looks vigorous. It is climbing the cage, reaching toward the sun, doing exactly what a growing thing is supposed to do. And then midsummer arrives. The fruit sets, and what comes out of that lush, leafy plant is disappointing. Small tomatoes, sparse clusters, a plant that spent all summer building itself instead of building food. My name is Hannah Yoder. I am Amish. I farm in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, on land my family has worked for 4 generations. And I want to tell you something that will change how you look at a tomato plant for the rest of your life. The problem is not that your plant is unhealthy. The problem is that your plant is confused. And the confusion started the moment it went into the ground. Stay with me. Here is the first thing most modern gardeners get backwards about a tomato plant. They treat it like a flower. Something to be admired from above, kept tidy, given water when the soil looks dry, fed a little fertilizer from a bag, and left alone to do its work. The traditional growers I was raised among treated it like an animal, something with appetites that needed managing. Something that, if left to its own devices, would make choices that were not always in the garden's best interest. Something that needed not just feeding, but direction. That difference in thinking produced different gardens. You would have seen this if you had walked through the kitchen gardens of the old Pennsylvania German homesteads. The plants were not bushes. They were trained, disciplined, almost. Single stems, or 2 stems, running straight up a line of twine, or a wooden stake, the lower leaves removed, the soil at the base dark, and mulched, and bare of weeds. They did not look like the tomato cages you see in garden centers today, with the plant exploding outward in every direction like a green cloud. They looked intentional, and they produced fruit the way a fruit tree produces fruit. Heavily, reliably, with very little wasted effort. The reason comes down to one fact about the tomato plant that most people have never been told, and once you understand it, you cannot look at a tomato plant the same way again. A tomato plant, left entirely to itself, will always choose leaves over fruit, not because something is wrong with it, because of what it is. The tomato is a perennial plant in its native climate. It evolved in the highlands of western South America, in a place where the growing season does not end in October. In its natural state, a tomato plant grows for years, not months, and a plant with years ahead of it has no particular reason to hurry toward fruit. It can afford to spend this season building structure, roots, canopy, and come back to fruit production when the conditions are right. We brought that plant into a northern kitchen garden and gave it 4 months to do a year's worth of work, and we expected it to redirect priorities it built over millions of years of evolution. It does not always cooperate. What the old growers understood, through observation and long practice, is that you have to manage a tomato plant the way you would manage any working animal. You have to tell it what the job is. You have to structure the plant so that the energy going into it has only one place to go. And that process begins before the plant ever goes into the ground. Walk into any old-time kitchen garden in Lancaster County in late May and watch how a transplant is handled. The gardener does not simply dig a hole the size of the root ball, drop the plant in at soil level, and fill it back in. She strips the lower leaves off the stem, a third of the plant, sometimes half, depending on how leggy the transplant has grown. Those leaves come off clean. Then she digs deep, not wide, deep. She sets that plant down into the soil so that only the top few sets of leaves are showing above the ground. Everything below is buried. Most people watching that for the first time think something has gone wrong. The plant looks half buried. It does not look like a plant being given a good start. It looks like a plant being punished. But the reason for it is one of the most useful things a gardener can know. Every hair on the stem of a tomato plant can become a root. Every single one. That is not a folk saying. That is plant biology. The tomato stem is covered in what botanists call adventitious root initials, small structures that when they come into contact with moist soil will develop into a full root system. When you bury 2/3 of that stem, you are not covering a plant. You are planting a root system that does not exist yet. Within a few weeks, that buried stem will put out roots from every buried node. The plant that results is not anchored by the small root ball it came in with. It is anchored by an entirely new system, wider, deeper, and more capable of pulling water and minerals from the soil than anything you could have grown in a transplant tray. A plant with that kind of root structure does not struggle in dry spells the way a shallow-rooted plant does. It does not keel over in a summer storm. It does not run short on calcium or phosphorus during the weeks when fruit is setting, and the plant needs those minerals most. The old growers did not have the scientific vocabulary for what they were doing. They knew that planting deep made plants that produced better. They knew it from watching. The explanation came later. The observation came first. And at the bottom of that deep planting hole, the Lancaster County families often place something that most modern gardeners have never heard of for tomatoes: rock phosphate. Not a chemical fertilizer, a mined mineral, soft and powdery, the same way diatomaceous earth is a mined mineral. Ground rock that contains the phosphorus that forms in ancient marine sediments. Before synthetic fertilizers became common after the Second World War, rock phosphate was one of the standard amendments in American kitchen gardens. You can still find it at farm supply stores. It dissolves slowly, releasing phosphorus into the soil over months and years. And phosphorus is not the nutrient most people think about for tomatoes. Nitrogen is what most people reach for. It makes things green. It makes things grow fast. A nitrogen-fed tomato plant will give you exactly what you are probably getting right now. Big leaves, strong stem, a plant that looks prosperous and produces less than you hoped. Phosphorus does something different. Phosphorus drives root development. Phosphorus drives flowering. Phosphorus drives fruit set. A handful of rock phosphate worked into the bottom of the planting hole is not feeding the plant today. It is building the plant's ability to feed itself over the entire season, to set flowers, to push those flowers through to fruit instead of dropping them in the heat. The old growers called phosphorus-rich soil good ground. They knew what it did without having the word phosphorus available to them. They observed that gardens amended with bone meal, or with certain kinds of wood ash, or with the particular compost from certain rotted plant materials, produced more fruit per plant than gardens that simply had plenty of manure. They were tracking a pattern. The pattern pointed to phosphorus even when they had no word for it. Now the transplant is in the ground, deep. The lower leaves are off. Rock phosphate is beneath it. The first watering is generous, and then the gardener watches for something specific: the first flower cluster. Most modern gardening advice says to celebrate that first cluster of yellow flowers. It means the plant is ready to fruit. In the old kitchen garden tradition, that first cluster was removed, pinched off, discarded. This seems like exactly the wrong thing to do. You are trying to grow tomatoes. The plant is offering you its first attempt at making tomatoes, and the traditional grower takes it away. The reasoning is not complicated, but it requires a longer view than most modern gardens allow. At the point when a tomato plant sets its first flowers, it has been in the ground for 3 or 4 weeks. Its roots are still establishing. The buried stem is still developing its new root network. The plant is not yet able to support the full demand that fruit development will place on its system. If you allow that first cluster to set fruit, the plant will put significant resources into developing those early tomatoes, resources that would otherwise be going into roots, into the foundation. Pinching the first cluster redirects those resources. The plant does not stop growing. It simply deepens instead of fruiting. By the time the second and third flower clusters arrive, the root system is more developed. The plant is better positioned to carry fruit through to full size without the stress that leads to blossom end rot, to cracking, to the small underdeveloped tomatoes that fill the cage but never seem to grow properly. You give up the first few weeks of fruit. You gain a stronger plant for the rest of the season. The old growers talked about it the way a farmer talks about a young animal that is not yet ready to work. You do not put a load on a young animal before it has its full strength. You wait. The work gets done better when the animal is ready. A tomato plant is not so different. By the time those second and third clusters are setting, the real management work begins. This is where the difference between the traditional kitchen garden and the modern home garden becomes most visible. The tomato plant is trying to become a bush again. At every junction where a leaf meets the main stem, there is a small shoot waiting. Gardeners call them suckers. Old-timers sometimes called them laterals or side shoots or simply the armpits of the plant because that is exactly where they grow. In the angle between the leaf and the stem, a small green growth appears, reaching outward, wanting to become a branch. If you let every sucker grow, you get that familiar tomato bush. Dense, dark, full of leaves. The plant is happy. The plant is doing exactly what its evolutionary programming tells it to do. Building canopy, establishing structure, preparing for a long life. You will get some tomatoes, but the plant's energy is spread across a dozen growing tips instead of concentrated in a few fruiting stems. The traditional management practice is to remove those suckers when they are small, before they put down their own root claims on the plant's resources. A thumbnail and a thumbnail's worth of effort. Snap them off clean. What you are left with is a plant with one or two main stems, all of the plant's energy moving through those stems. Every bit of what the root system draws up from the soil, channeling into the flowers, the fruit set, the swelling tomatoes. The plant looks different. Spare, almost, exposed. You can see through it instead of looking at a wall of leaves. And it produces differently. Not more plants. Exactly. More fruit per plant. Larger fruit. Fruit that develops fully because the plant had enough resources to see it through. This is the practice that separates what most home gardeners grow from what the dedicated kitchen garden families grew. Not a different variety, not a different fertilizer, not a different watering system, a different understanding of where the plant's energy goes and whose job it is to direct it. The Amish and Old German farming families who settled Lancaster County brought this knowledge from the Palatinate region of what is now southwestern Germany. Kitchen garden management in that tradition was considered skilled work. It was passed from mother to daughter, from older gardener to younger one. It had its own vocabulary, its own rules. The rules were not complicated, but they required daily attention. A walk through the garden with sharp eyes and a willingness to remove things that looked healthy, because healthy growth in the wrong place was still growth in the wrong place. Watching plants rather than simply tending them was the real skill. There is a second management habit that connects to this, and it involves water, and it is where modern home gardens go wrong in a way that is very difficult to see until the damage is done. Most home gardeners water when the soil looks dry. They walk past the plant, see that the surface looks pale or cracked, and run the hose over it until it looks wet. Then they walk away. The problem is not the amount of water. The problem is the rhythm. A tomato plant that dries out significantly between waterings and then receives a heavy soaking is a tomato plant under stress, not visible stress, not wilting or yellowing, but internal stress. The kind that shows up later in the season, when the fruit is swelling, as blossom end rot, as cracking, as split tomatoes on the vine that seem to be developing normally right up until they were not. Blossom end rot is not a calcium deficiency in the soil. Most soils have adequate calcium. It is a calcium delivery problem. When a plant dries out and then floods, the irregular movement of water through the roots disrupts the plant's ability to move calcium to the developing fruit. The fruit cannot form properly at the blossom end. The tissue breaks down. The old kitchen garden solution was not a calcium spray. It was even moisture. Never bone dry, never flooded, consistently damp the way good soil should be, the way soil under a tree canopy in a forest is damp, holding moisture without drowning. The mulch that the traditional gardeners always kept around their tomato plants was not primarily for weed control. It was for moisture regulation. A thick layer of straw or leaf mulch over the soil at the base of each plant held the moisture in the soil through the heat of the day, reduced the dramatic wet-dry cycling that the unprotected soil experienced, and kept the water delivery to the roots more even. There is one more piece of this that modern gardeners almost never think about, and it goes back to where the water comes from. In the old kitchen gardens, tomato plants were not watered from above. The watering can or the bucket was tipped close to the soil, near the base of the plant, and the water went to the roots. Overhead watering, the kind you get from a sprinkler or from holding a hose over the plant, puts water on the leaves. Wet leaves, in warm weather, are an invitation to disease, fungal problems, blight, leaf spot. The old growers understood this through observation long before plant pathology explained the mechanism. Leaves that stay wet breed trouble. Leaves that stay dry do not. Water the ground, not the plant. keep the leaves dry, keep the roots wet. That simple habit, practiced consistently across a long season, produces a plant that does not spend energy fighting off the fungal pressures that turn so many late summer tomato gardens into a struggle. And there is one more piece of this to name before we set down the tools and look at what we have built. All of these practices, the deep planting, the pinching of first flowers, the removal of suckers, the even watering, the ground-level irrigation, none of them stands alone. None of them is the trick. They are a system. They work because they work together. The deep planting builds a root system capable of feeding a heavily fruiting plant. The phosphorus in the planting hole gives that root system something worth reaching for. The pinched first flowers let the root system mature before the fruiting demands begin. The removed suckers concentrate the plant's energy into the stems that are actually fruiting. The even moisture keeps the calcium moving and the disease pressure low. And the thing connecting all of them is observation. Daily attention to what the plant is doing and what it needs redirected. Modern gardening has made tools and products available for almost every problem a tomato plant can develop. Blossom end rot spray, fungicide, slow-release fertilizer spikes, tomato cage systems that expand and contract, each one solving a problem after it has already appeared. The traditional kitchen garden system was built around not having those problems in the first place, not through more intervention, but through better timed intervention. Through understanding the plant's tendencies and working with them rather than correcting them after the fact. There is a word in the old Pennsylvania German farming tradition. It does not translate well. It is sometimes rendered as economy, but it means something closer to the right use of what you have. Not extravagance, not stinginess. The right amount, in the right place, at the right time, nothing wasted, nothing missing. A well-managed kitchen garden tomato plant is Wirtschaft, made visible. Deep roots, clean stem, focused energy, even water, daily attention. The plant knows how to grow tomatoes. It has been doing this for a great deal longer than we have been growing it. What the traditional gardener provided was not the capacity. The capacity was always there. What the traditional gardener provided was the structure, the conditions under which the plant's own tendencies could be directed toward what the family needed. That is not really a gardening secret. It is barely even a technique. It is an understanding. The expensive bag of fertilizer, the specialized cage system, the foliar spray, the automatic drip timer with its app and its soil sensors. These are all attempting to provide from the outside what a plant that is properly directed and properly rooted provides for itself. There are gardens in Lancaster County that have been growing tomatoes in the same soil for 100 years or more. The soil there is not depleted. It is richer than when the first seeds went in, because the composting habits, the deep planting, the root systems left in the soil at the end of each season, the mulch returned to the earth year after year, all of it built something over time that a single season of commercial fertilizer cannot replicate. Soil is not the stage on which plants perform. Soil is most of the performance. And the families who understood that, who fed the soil before they fed the plant, who built the ground before they built the garden, those families grew tomatoes that a 2-week gardener with a bag of fertilizer cannot quite match, even with better seed. It is possible to grow a respectable crop of tomatoes by doing what the garden center suggests. Buy the transplants, set them at soil level, cage them, fertilize them on schedule, spray the problems as they arrive, and harvest what results. You will get tomatoes. But there is a different kind of garden, one that asks more of the gardener and produces more from the plant. A garden that is paying attention to where the energy goes and why. A garden that understands the plant's tendencies and has decided to direct them rather than simply observe them. The old German and Amish kitchen gardens were that second kind. Not because the people were smarter, because they could not afford to be wrong. Every plant in a kitchen garden that went to leaves instead of food was a family that ate less in October. The stakes made them careful. The carefulness made them accurate. And the accuracy passed down, season by season, generation by generation, into a set of practices that most modern gardeners have never encountered. The question worth sitting with is not whether any individual practice from that tradition produces measurably more tomatoes. The question worth sitting with is what we lost when gardening became a hobby instead of a necessity. When the stakes came down, the attention followed. And when the attention followed, the knowledge stopped being essential. Some of it is still in the seed catalogs, scattered in the variety descriptions. Some of it is still in the agricultural extension bulletins from the 1,930 seconds and 1,940 seconds before the industry moved toward chemical solutions. Some of it is still being practiced in the Amish and Old Order Mennonite kitchen gardens of Lancaster and Holmes and Dauphin counties, not because anyone decided to preserve it, but because those families never stopped needing it. A plant that is well-rooted, properly directed, and consistently cared for does not need rescuing. That may be the oldest piece of gardening wisdom there is. And the gardener who learns to manage a plant instead of simply tending it is learning something that goes further than tomatoes. It goes into how we think about soil, and about patience, and about the difference between a garden that survives the season and a garden that builds on itself year after year until the ground itself becomes something different from what it was. That kind of garden is not made in a season. It is made in the habit of watching, and the habit of directing what you see, and the long, slow accumulation of seasons in which the soil remembered what was put into it. The tomato plants in such a garden do not look like the ones in the garden center photographs. They look intentional, and at the end of summer, when the canning jars are full and the vines are starting to slow, there is something in that garden that the fertilizer bag and the automated irrigation timer cannot account for. The gardener who grew it knows exactly where every one of those tomatoes came from, not from a trick, from understanding. And that makes you wonder how many other things we grow have been waiting all this time for the same kind of attention.